So in the last lecture, I ended when I talked about four forms of governance. And so again, I want you to remind you that all of these words are used in um, modern English and are used in discussing political systems. They were done a little different than the way that we would use them now, but they have all the same kind of connotations that they're not far removed from the original meaning, okay? So monarchy would be ruled by one man, and an aristocracy would be ruled by well-born class of citizens, okay, nobles. We still use this term aristocracy today, and monarchy. Um, Oligarchy ruled by a select few, and democracy, a very important word, ruled by an entire body of citizens. So again, I want to remind you, this class is on Western civilization, and here with the Greeks, it's really clear that their legacy leaves a huge imprint on our society. Our political system is considered a democracy. We chose to oppose having an aristocracy and a monarchy that, for instance, Britain had at the time when we got independence. But some people debate whether or not that we really have a democracy, and say, do we in fact actually have an oligarchy? That's something for you to decide. But again, I want to just show you that these systems that they had and the concepts behind them do influence the very way we talk about politics now, right? And our own systems. So democracy means rule by the people. But now we think of rule by the people, democracy, as all of us that live in this country as citizens. Essentially, democracy then was still a small select few, but people that were considered citizens in that few people compared to slaves, yes, they had political rights. In a sense, it's like in America, where Native Americans and Black Africans that were slaves, and even women, and early on men without property, did not have the same kind of rights as white men with property did in the United States. And so democracy has always been a project that has a concept of equality, but it doesn't necessitate it. And we'll talk more about this with slavery, but I just want to remind you, Southern intellects before the Civil War would argue that anybody criticizing the notion of democracy with slavery is not paying attention to history. That the Greeks, who come up with the very idea, which is also going to be incorporated into ideas of Rome, were slave holding societies. Democracy and slavery have always gone together. That's kind of chilling, isn't it? Just think about that for a second. And by the way, apartheid South Africa was democratic. North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So, what's interesting is that North Korea uses the word democratic, a Greek concept, even in its own system. But of course, it's a very different type of democracy as well, right? So what's important is to realize that these terms influence the West and even many other parts of the world, but we always want to pay attention to what's really being meant when these terms are used later on. But in this case, this is what we want to look for history early on. This is what we're talking about, okay? And then you had these systems opposed to tyranny, the illegal seizure of power. So now the textbook points out that the word tyranny now has a purely negative connotation. To be tyrannical, and anything you do, let alone politics, is very you are an oppressor, right? For what this word was used originally was, you could be a good ruler. You could be a better ruler as a tyrant than, an aristocrat or an oligarchic system, except that those had some sort of voting or consensus to who was going to have power, even if it was limited. This was when somebody just basically seized power because they could and no one could get in the way. And that was the where the source of their power came from, a sort of might makes right type of thing outside of consensus building. Okay, so that's how it was used then. Of course, it evolves into now kind of pejorative term for a system that we would see now as awful. So while North Korea, for instance, calls itself a democratic people's republic, okay, which is using Greek and Roman concepts in the title, many Americans accuse North Korea of having a tyranny by its leader and in the military government there. Again, I'm not here to debate that, but that's just kind of the way that these terms are used now, and as opposed to how they were used then. So I hope that wasn't confusing. So actually, real quick. Okay, so just think about mainly what I wanted you to focus on is the way that the systems of these small states really left their impact on the West. And it's very clear to see, even in our language we use now. Okay. The other aspect we're having to do with things from the archaic Greek period and its colonization from 750 to 550. And, we are able to get these ideas from Greece because fortunately they were also writing their ideas down. Okay, so first of all, let me just kind of cover this period for a second here. And here again is map. Okay, so here we see Greece, and here we see Phoenicia, and there's Mesopotamia over here. Okay, and so one that I want to focus on is that Greek culture began to dominate the Mediterranean world. If you look here, here's the Mediterranean Sea, okay? And they then came in contact with Phoenicians. And this is really significant because it links what we talked about earlier with Phoenicians coming up with the concept of the alphabet, okay? And essentially bringing many things into Western culture from the areas in which we covered in earlier chapters. So if you look in your book on page 79, for example, it says that because of harsh living conditions on the mainland during the Dark Age, many Greeks moved to a region called Ionia on the coast of the islands of Western Anatolia. Relatively isolated from other Greek communities, these pioneers developed their own dialect of the Greek language. By 800, the Ionian Greeks were regularly interacting with the Phoenicians in the Mediterranean. And so from the period of 750 to 650, ideas came into Greece from the Near East, the Middle East as we call it now, through contact with Phoenicians, and basically poets, merchants, refugees, doctors, slaves, and all of these things brought in a lot of Middle Eastern ideas from Phoenicia into the Greek world. Okay, so remember this writing here came from the Phoenicians, and it is going to evolve into the Greek alphabet, and eventually that's going to evolve into the Latin alphabet, which we have. Okay, so this is very important. And so I hope that also in this section, I just mainly wanted you to be able to kind of visualize a little bit more now how, as we brought up these other cultures in the past and why they would be relevant, or where the connections are all linking together to formulate what we're going to be having when it comes to Western civilization. Okay. So I'm going to end this lecture right here, and then we're going to talk about some of the important Greek city-states that are talked about in the book and influence the imagination of Western intellectuals and political thinkers and philosophers for centuries to come. Oops, where are we?